Soft light filtered through the linen curtains at the window, and the distant sound of leaves dancing in the wind was the only sign that time was still passing. Seated in an old armchair, her hands resting gently on a blue-covered notebook, Meryl Streep turned the pages with the calm of someone who already knew exactly where the story would lead. Beside her, her husband Harold slept peacefully in one of the chairs on the patio of the home where they had lived for the past 3 years. He no longer remembered her name, nor his own. Every morning, Meryl put on her warmest smile and walked there with the notebook tucked under her arm. It had become a routine she turned into a ritual, not just for him, but for herself as well. Within those pages were memories that had woven the fabric of her life. Sunlit days, letters exchanged during the Vietnam War, difficult choices, silent reunions. It was there that her love story lived, fragmented perhaps, but still worthy of being heard. "May I tell you a story?" she asked, with a voice that blended tenderness and familiarity. Harold, still without recognizing her, looked at her with curiosity and nodded, as if, even without knowing why, he trusted that woman completely. Meryl began to read. It was the summer of 1967 when Clara Bowen arrived in the small town of Savannah, Georgia, wearing a white dress and carrying a restless heart. She came from the north, from a family accustomed to comfort, but she longed for something more genuine, more real. It was at the village market that she met Daniel Morrison, a simple young man, his hands rough from helping his father at the general store. Their eyes met between stalls of fruit and children's laughter, and right then, the world seemed to grow still. As she read, Meryl watched Harold's expression. Sometimes he furrowed his brow, as if something deep inside was trying to remember something long forgotten. Other times, he smiled faintly. She knew it wasn't much, but she also knew that love, in its purest form, doesn't require recognition, only presence. Reading to Harold was like blowing softly on nearly extinguished embers. A simple gesture, yet full of hope. When she finished the first chapter of Clara and Daniel's story, she gently closed the notebook and lightly touched his hand. "If you'd like, I can continue tomorrow," she said softly. Harold looked at her with empty eyes and said only, "I like your voice," and that was enough. And maybe if you've made it this far with your heart touched, this video has served its purpose. If you feel like it, leave a like or subscribe, not out of habit, but because it helps me keep sharing stories like this one with the calm and care they deserve. The next morning, the breeze was warmer and the sky clearer. Meryl arrived promptly at 9. She carried with her the same blue notebook and a small, embroidered handkerchief that had once belonged to her mother. She sat down with the same gentle care beside Harold, who was watching the birds with that faraway, yet enchanted look, so common in those who still see beauty in small things, even when memory begins to fade. "Are you ready for the next part?" she asked with a quiet smile. Harold turned to her slowly, as if reflecting for a moment, and replied, "Yes, please." She opened the notebook to the page marked with a white ribbon and continued. Clara and Daniel began meeting every Saturday morning between crates of tomatoes and conversations under the trees in the square. Daniel showed Clara the world through the eyes of someone who owned little but felt everything. She, in turn, taught him beautiful words like nostalgia and beginning again, words he didn't use but understood with his heart. They weren't alike, but they fit. Meryl paused briefly, as if breathing the same breeze from 1967. Harold remained attentive, and for a fleeting moment, he seemed to furrow his brow at the mention of the name Clara, as if it stirred something faint and familiar, tucked away in a forgotten drawer of his mind. When Daniel was drafted to serve in the Vietnam War, Clara began writing him one letter a day. Not all of them arrived. Some got lost along the way, others may never have been read. But still, she wrote, as if keeping a candle lit through a storm. Meryl glanced at Harold, but said nothing. His eyes were cast downward, as though the words moved through him quietly and deeply. Perhaps he was remembering, or perhaps he was simply feeling. Daniel replied only a few times. It wasn't easy to find paper or a pen, and the days were too heavy to fit into a single page. But when he did write, he was direct. I miss you. I thought of you when I saw a lone tree. I keep your handkerchief in my uniform pocket. Short phrases, tremendous meaning. Meryl closed the notebook for a moment and gently touched Harold's shoulder. You wrote letters too, you know? Not many, but they were beautiful. I still have them. Harold looked at her like someone searching for a memory in the dark. Then he smiled, almost as a reflex. You were my Clara. She didn't answer. She simply took his hand with tenderness. Some questions, she had learned, do not need immediate answers. They need continuity. And tomorrow, with the same notebook and the same love, she would return to read another chapter. That morning, rain was in the forecast, but Meryl went anyway. She carried the blue-covered notebook and a floral pattern umbrella she had used for decades. She knew that although the skies threatened to close in, there were other clouds harder to chase away, the ones that settled quietly in the corners of memory. Harold was there, as always, sitting in his favorite chair on the patio. A blanket rested on his legs, and a cup of tea sat cooling in his hands. When Meryl approached, he lifted his eyes slowly and for a brief moment seemed to smile without knowing why. She sat beside him and opened the notebook with the calm of someone preparing to relive a well-worn story. Clara waited, year after year, even when the newspapers said many wouldn't return, even when her friends married and her parents urged her to move on. But Clara never forgot Daniel. She used to say there was a part of her heart that still beat somewhere in Vietnam. Meryl paused, glancing sideways at Harold. He remained still, eyes fixed on the trees, but his fingers tapped softly on the blanket, like someone who hears without hearing, who feels without fully understanding. When the war finally ended, Clara was no longer the same girl in the white dress. There was a new kind of stillness in her. And one ordinary spring afternoon, while she was cleaning the windows of her old house, she saw a man standing in the rain. Soaked from head to toe, eyes full of longing, he watched her as if he had spent all those years walking just to arrive at that very moment. Meryl smiled to herself, remembering her own reunion with Harold. It hadn't happened in the rain, but it was just as unexpected. After years apart, life had found a way to bring them back together, as if someone had carefully stitched back what time had tried to unravel. Clara ran downstairs, not even bothering to put on her shoes. When she opened the door, Daniel was trembling, not from a cold, but from emotion. "You're here," she said, and he replied simply, "I always was." At that moment, a soft drizzle began to fall over the garden. Meryl closed the notebook gently to shield it from the moisture and placed her hand over Harold's. He looked at her, eyes damp, and murmured, "I waited for you." It was as if the words had come from the depths of an old, buried memory. Meryl smiled tenderly, asking no questions. Perhaps he was referring to the story, or perhaps in that rare moment he was speaking as Harold, her Harold. She didn't need to know for sure. The beauty was in the feeling. The next day, the sky was clear at dawn, though the air still carried the scent of rain. Meryl arrived a little earlier, hoping to enjoy the soft light of the morning. Harold was sitting in the sun, his eyes half closed, as if letting the warmth whisper long-forgotten secrets to him. She settled beside him and opened the notebook, gently running her fingers over the pages before she resumed reading. Clara and Daniel picked up where they had left off, but they were no longer the same. Daniel carried the marks of war, not just the visible ones, but the others, the ones harder to name. Clara understood. Over time, she had learned how to listen to silence. That's why she never asked why it had taken him so long. She simply embraced him. Meryl paused and looked at Harold. He was listening, his eyes lightly misted over, as if walking quietly inside the story. Together, they restored the old house where Clara had grown up. They painted the walls in light colors, kept the windows open at all times, and built a small garden filled with flowers Daniel claimed he had only ever seen in dreams. It was a simple life, but rich in gentle rituals. Coffee made in an enamel kettle, letters exchanged even though they shared a roof, soft music playing on the radio, while Clara embroidered and Daniel watered the plants. Meryl couldn't help but think of the early years of her marriage to Harold. The modest house, the out-of-tune guitar on the porch, the notes hidden between pages of books, the scent of cinnamon in the fall. She allowed herself a soft sigh, not of sadness, but of gratitude. One night, Daniel had a nightmare. He woke up breathless, his hands trembling. Clara held him in the dark, whispering words he couldn't quite hear, but could feel. After that, she began writing in a notebook every evening. She wrote about the day, about dreams, about fears too quiet to name. She said it was to keep the silence from taking over. Meryl stopped for a moment. She took Harold's hand and held it gently. "I wrote for a long time too, for you. Even when you started to forget. I wrote so I wouldn't lose you completely." He didn't answer, but he looked at her differently. A look that seemed to recognize her, even if he didn't fully understand. It was in that notebook that years later, Clara began to retell their story. Not just for herself, but for Daniel, because she knew that one day he might need to be reminded of everything they had lived. Meryl closed the notebook softly, as if the gesture sealed a chapter of her soul. Harold, in a thin voice, asked, "Will there be more tomorrow?" She smiled, her eyes glistening. "There will. So much more." As the weeks went by, Meryl began to notice small but meaningful changes. Harold, who used to react with surprise to her presence, now seemed to wait for her. Not with words, but with that gentle stillness of someone expecting something they cannot quite explain. At times, he looked at her as if his soul recognized what his mind could no longer name. That morning, the sky was overcast. A soft gray blanket hung over the house's patio, and the wind stirred lightly, scattering dry leaves along the stone paths. Meryl arrived with the blue-covered notebook in her hands and a small sprig of lavender tucked between its pages. As she sat down, she saw that Harold was dozing, and for a few quiet moments, she simply watched him. His face, though aged, still held the sweetness of long ago, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his lips slightly parted in sleep, the features of someone who had lived deeply. She began to read, not knowing if he could hear her. Perhaps he was listening from some hidden place inside where memories rest like stones at the bottom of a lake. Clara knew something was changing in Daniel. He was starting to forget small things, the path to the post office, the name of a neighbor, where he had left his glasses. At first, she gently tried to correct him, like someone arranging flowers in a vase. But over time, she realized the most important thing wasn't remembering the street name. It was feeling that someone was there, beside him, ready to walk with him. Meryl paused and looked at Harold. His eyes remained closed, but his fingers moved slowly across the blanket, as if following the rhythm of her voice. Daniel began waking up in the middle of the night, confused, asking where he was. Clara would hold him and whisper softly, "You're home. You're with me." Those words became her mantra, his anchor. Because even when everything went dark in his mind, she remained. She was the one thing he didn't need to remember, because she was simply there. There was serenity in Meryl's voice. Reading to Harold was a quiet act of love, a kind of prayer woven from letters. There wasn't always a response, but there was always devotion. Clara began writing in a new notebook, a journal of love and care. She wrote down what Daniel liked to hear, the songs that calmed him, the stories that still made him smile. She said she was building a bridge between two worlds, hers full of memories and his made of fleeting moments. At that point in the reading, Harold opened his eyes and looked at Meryl for a long time. She stopped reading, uncertain. Then he said, with a trembling voice, "You read to me with your heart." Meryl smiled, and soft tears slipped down her cheeks. "Yes, my love, that's how I've always loved you." And on that cloudy morning, even without certainty, she felt that love still lived there. Not in the clarity of words, but in the silence of hands held tightly together. It was the heart of autumn. The trees surrounding the house were painted in shades of orange and gold, and the leaf-covered paths rustled beneath one's footsteps. Meryl walked slowly, as she always did, but that day there was a nostalgic sweetness in her steps. The blue notebook had aged along with them, its edges worn, the ribbon faded, its pages slightly yellowed. Yet what it held inside still pulsed with life. Harold was on the patio, wrapped in a checkered blanket, gazing up at the sky. She approached and sat beside him, just as she had for so many months. She didn't ask if she could read. She simply opened the notebook and began. Daniel only recognized Clara in fleeting moments. They were precious seconds, brief as the flutter of a bird's wings, but enough to make every effort worthwhile. In those moments, he smiled, called her by name, touched her hand like someone finding something lost and beloved. Meryl took a deep breath and continued, her voice trembling slightly but steady. Clara read to him every day, even when Daniel seemed far away, even when it looked like he couldn't hear. She kept reading because she knew that words carry their own memory. That love, when lived deeply, doesn't vanish, it only transforms. It becomes gesture, presence, faith. Harold didn't say anything, but his eyes were on her, watchful, tender. It was as if he couldn't grasp every word, but could feel the soul behind them. One late afternoon, Daniel fell asleep while Clara read the final page. She closed the notebook with a kiss on the cover and stayed there in silence. For the first time, she didn't cry, because she understood that everything they had lived was still there, not only in words, but in the way she would go on loving him, even beyond forgetting. Meryl slowly closed the notebook. Harold was breathing steadily, his eyes still fixed on her. "That was a beautiful story," he murmured. "Very beautiful." She smiled sweetly and replied, "It's ours." And for a brief moment, he seemed to understand, as if the fog had lifted and he could see clearly. He reached for her hand, and she held his in return, saying nothing more. The afternoon drifted gently into evening. The leaves kept dancing, and the world around them moved forward. But between Meryl and Harold, in that small moment of recognition, time seemed to stop. It was love. It still was. And if this story touched your heart in any way, Cherry Blossom, leave a comment sharing a memory this story brought back to you. I read every single one with care and gratitude. Cherry Blossom.